Welcome, everyone, to the special session of the 2023 Indeed International Policy and Practitioners Forum, looking at how we can improve evidence-based evaluation and evidence-based policy and practice. We have the distinct pleasure of having with us today Michael Quinn Patton, who has been one of the pioneering innovators in the field of evaluation over decades. Michael, I have to say I have been inspired by and learned from your work for years. Developmental evaluation and your writing on it has become one of my favorite, and work that we do. Also, your wonderful work on facilitation, evaluation facilitation, and utilization-focused evaluation, and so much more. We are very glad to have you together with us today. We are joined by colleagues coming from a range of backgrounds, policymakers and practitioners, people working in law enforcement, from civil society organizations, and a community engaging primarily in the fields of working to address violent extremism, radicalization, and hate, and looking here in the Indeed Forum at how can we improve how we approach trying to learn from and understand what we're doing in the field. What works, what doesn't work, what do we mean by evidence, and what type of evidence is needed, and how do we get it in ways that can actually feed into ownership and empowerment and making meaningful contributions as we try to improve practice and work in the field. It is a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for joining, and I'm just going to hand it straight over to you for the special talk session of the forum.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. This is incredibly important work. As you've noted, I've been at this for more than 50 years, and the stakes keep getting higher and higher for sorting out how we move forward in the world. So I'm going to share some slides, my thoughts about these issues and what it takes to make sense of and act on evidence. And basically what I'll be arguing is that from my experience, getting evidence is less the problem than making sense of evidence. We have a great deal of evidence in virtually every arena that is not well used, not well understood, and that my work for 50 years on getting evaluations used points to the importance of helping people learn to make sense of data as a critical skill that is the ultimate challenge in having evidence actually make a difference. I want to begin with a classic study published in the Harvard Business Review 20 years ago called The High Cost of Accuracy. It's a study done by Kathleen Sutcliffe and Klaus Weber, in which they compared organizations that had begun strategic planning, and that they had one set of organizations that were putting a great deal of resources into getting more data and more accurate data, and the other group of companies that were committed instead to spend more time with the data they had trying to figure out what it meant. And they followed these two sets of organizations over time, and they concluded that, quote, the way senior executives interpret their business environment is more important for performance than how accurately they know their environment. Now, both sets of organizations had a lot of data. We're talking about where to put time and resources on the margin. They further concluded that it is a waste of resources to spend a lot of money increasing the marginal accuracy of data available to senior executives compared to the value of enhancing their capacity to interpret whatever data they have. Executives were more limited by a lack of capacity to make sense of data than by inadequate or inaccurate data. In essence, they found that what they called interpretive capacity or shared mindsets distinguished high performance more than data quality and accuracy. And so the challenge of helping people interpret data, we have a great deal of expertise in measurement and design and gathering data and analyzing it. But the challenges of sense making, as a teacher, I have found the hardest thing to help students learn, is how to move from data to sense making, meaning making, and judgment. Another example of this kind of challenge is in the work on big data. And here again, Harvard Business Review study that looked at big data, how it's actually used in organizations, and said good data won't guarantee good decisions. They write, global businesses have entered a new era of decision making. The ability to gather, store, access, and analyze data has grown exponentially. But for all the breathless promises about the return on investment in big data, companies face a challenge. Investments in analytics can be useless, even harmful, unless employees can incorporate that data into complex decision making. They go on to say, our research offers a succinct warning to managers. At this very moment, there's an odds-on chance that someone in your organization is making a poor decision on the basis of information that was enormously expensive to collect. They generate a typology of kinds of interpreters of data. One group they call the unquestioning empiricists, who really focus in on the analysis. Another group they called the visceral decision makers, who trust their gut more than data. And then they had a group they called the informed skeptics, who balance data and judgment. These employees, they said, are best equipped to make good decisions. They balance judgment and analysis, possess strong and analytic skills, listen to others' opinions, but are willing to dissent. They're the kind of data-savvy workers every company should try to cultivate. In their own work, looking at a number of companies, they found that on average, about just under 20% of the employees were visceral decision makers. 43% were unquestioning empiricists who just got into the data and thought they knew what it meant. And the informed skeptics that they value were in the middle group. And they conclude big data, no matter how comprehensive or well analyzed, needs to be complemented by big judgment. What this takes us to is the importance of the thinking process involved. I had the opportunity to visit the artificial intelligence lab at the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base outside of Dayton, Ohio, where they are trying to study and simulate in computer programs the thinking of great military minds and strategists, of great psychotherapists, of great architects, of great lawyers in different fields, to figure out how do the people who are recognized as the astute thinkers in a field, as the great contributors, thought leaders, how do they do what they do? And what they found was that these great thought leaders, as they did case studies of them, these great thought leaders did not come with predetermined answers or a set of predetermined knowledge. What they were especially skilled at was situation recognition. They had frameworks to make sense of the world, to make sense of data, to contextualize what was going on, and that the answers that they generated came out of this deep situation recognition and understanding of how to make sense of what a situation was. This is a version of what's sometimes called deep contextual intelligence or deep contextual thinking, to be able to recognize what the situation is that the evidence applies to, and how to apply evidence situationally. Eleanor Ostrom, the 2009 Nobel Prize in Economics, emphasized the importance of context in interpreting data. She wrote, individual behavior is strongly affected by the context in which interactions take place rather than simply a result of individual differences. This means that there are no best practices. That language, that insidious language of best practices, is a shallow form of thinking, because it would suggest that we had tested all possibilities and that one was that context didn't matter. If something's best, context doesn't matter, but context always matters. And so evidence-based practices, better practices, promising practices, there are bad practices, really bad practices. really, really bad practices, but no best practices. And the appropriate evaluation question is not just does it work, but the more nuanced question, what works for whom, in what ways, under what conditions, with what results, in what context? A deeper thinking inquiry into the nature of evidence. This becomes increasingly important as we recognize the connection between patterns and individuality or particularity. The worldwide highly prestigious Mayo Clinic has a Center for Individualized Medicine in which you can use general data to interpret your individual data. And each of us is our own interrupted time series designed for health studies. And in that regard, being able to think deeply, make sense of data, really was highlighted in a special issue of the American Statistician that some of you no doubt have seen. They put out a special issue just as the pandemic was hitting, entitled Moving to a World Beyond P less than 0.05. And in that special issue, they ban the term statistically significant. In the opening chapter, they say, regardless of whether it was ever useful, a declaration of statistical significance has today become meaningless because it become mechanistic, because the significance level kept people from thinking about what the data actually mean. And so they want to ban from all research, from all evaluation, from all reports, from all publications, ban the term statistically significant because it short circuits deep thinking and sense making. They write, yet solid principles for the use of statistics do exist, and they are well explained in this special issue. We summarize our recommendations in 2 sentences totaling 7 words. Accept uncertainty, be thoughtful, open, and modest. The acronym ATOM. And they conclude by saying, the initial slow speed of progress should not be discouraging. That is how all broad-based social movements move forward, and we should be playing the long game. But the ball is rolling downhill. The current generation is inspired and impatient to carry this forward. Now remember, these are statisticians talking. So let's do it. Let's move beyond, quote, statistically significant, unquote, even if upheaval and disruption are inevitable for the time being. It's worth it. In a world beyond P less than 0.05, by breaking free from the bonds of statistical significance, statistics in science and policy will become more significant than ever. They're trying to get people to think, accept uncertainty, be thoughtful, be open, be modest, to think deeply about what the data mean, to emphasize substantive significance rather than mechanistic statistical significance. And so evaluation is involved in that kind of thinking. Michael Scriven suggested that evaluation is a transdiscipline, like philosophy and statistics. Evaluation science is necessary for all the other sciences because evaluative thinking is core to all scientific and policy inquiries. Which brings us to the important historical work of Hannah Arendt, who is back in the news these days because of her studies of the Holocaust. She observed the trials, she interviewed senior Nazi officials, and she came up with the phrase, the banality of evil, and suggested that what was going on was not a grand buy-in to the Nazi approach, but a clueless, unthinking approach to it. She had herself escaped Germany just before it became impossible to get out. She devoted much of her life to studying how the Holocaust had happened and the opposite democracy. And she believed that thinking rigorously in public deliberations and acting democratically were intertwined. Totalitarianism, she wrote, is built on and sustained by deceit and thought control. In order to resist efforts by the powerful to deceive and control thinking, Arendt believed that people needed to learn to think. Her teaching assistant was Elizabeth Minnick, who is a colleague who I've known for many years. And 3 years ago, she came out with a book updating Hannah Arendt's work that she called The Evil of Banality. Turned the phrase the banality of evil around and looked at the evil banality, subtitled On the Life and Death Importance of Thinking. And in this important work, she goes into great depth about the way in which our work in many fields becomes routine and mechanistic and keeps us from thinking. She especially paid attention to the notion that thoughtlessness disables the conscience. With the mind disengaged and conscience disabled, it becomes possible for otherwise decent people to participate in systematized, extensive evils. She concluded that any education that fails to awaken, practice, support, and prioritize thinking, this most basic of human capacities, fails where it matters most. She went on to say, banality in evaluation is thoughtless compliance with bureaucratic and funding accountability requirements. Banality in evaluation, as in other arenas, manifests as a fundamental failure to think. Treating evaluation as routine, following the procedures, doing what's required, making it bureaucratic, making it a compliance activity. I was with an organization just a week ago, providing technical assistance. And it was clear that this very important international agency is driven by a compliance mentality, doing what they're supposed to do, bottom line accountability, least common denominator, and thoughtfulness and creativity are discouraged. Follow the rules, get the paperwork done, make it a compliance activity. She goes on to talk about the banality of goodness. So the banality of evil is pretty straightforward, but when I first read her discussion of banality of goodness, I found it quite jarring. It's all the more unsettling and profound and ultimately enlightening for that very reason. How can doing good be banal? To seriously ponder this question and understand the answer is to enter into what Minnick means by, quote, the life and death importance of thinking, close quote. She writes, purposely doing good can itself become unthinking, mindless, no more than a sop to conscience, a prop for conventionally defined self-esteem, a way of passing boring time on or earning points for some other purpose we have in mind. Getting into college, preparing to run for the school board, being thought to be good by our neighbors, seeking compliments from our co-religious colleagues, getting out of the house when retired. Certainly admirable things may be done as a result of all sorts of motivations, but that is no protection against banal conventionality, mindlessness. Even dramatic, intensive goodness can be motivated by a kind of reflex notion of heroism that is entirely conventional. It is then a matter of luck for the recipients of such acts as for the one acting, whether what is done thoughtlessly or done to turn out to help or hurt. Unthinking obedience, she continues, to or use of good conventions in decent enough time is evidently less frightening than when mindless conventionality enables massive evils. But thoughtlessness, any mindlessness, taking us through life on autopilot, puts us at serious risk of colluding and perhaps worse, colluding with the larger systems that shape our worlds, if as when they once again go wrong. The mystery really is not how so many good Germans could have become Nazis, nor how so many good Christians could have become slaveholders, or good Arab slave traders, or how many good parents could send their businesses overseas to profit from the virtually, sometimes actually enslaved labor of other people's children. The mystery, I fear, is how so many of us so often, without even thinking about it, no more do good than we do wrong or evil, but simply behave ourselves or absent ourselves or try to do well, whatever the terms of the game. We do not even choose. We simply reach into our grab bag of conventions, of process concepts, and follow the one that seems most familiar, most likely apt to be approved by the people who care about or supervise us. So we just keep walking, pay no attention, do not remember, do not feel, as is rightly said, called upon to do something. Realities call out to us, we do not hear. This can be the case even when we are doing something because we think it good. Anything can be done thoughtlessly. Anything can be done thoughtlessly. I see a lot of evaluation that is done thoughtlessly. The commissioning of evaluations, the terms of reference, the contracts, the rote midterm and into project requirements for evaluation that doesn't look at when data are needed, how decisions are made. The evaluation is often out of sync with decision making and budgeting and is done according to some pro forma, prescriptive, predetermined timelines. In utilization-focused evaluation, we've looked over the years about the need to have the data connected to actual phases of decision making. A rule in contract compliance is to deliver the report on time, the date specified in the contract. The utilization-focused evaluation principle is to target delivery of findings to be timely and useful for informing decisions and learning opportunities, monitor situational developments that may affect timeliness, be constantly thinking about what makes sense in what we do, how we do it, and when we do it. And so we find ourselves in this world where truth and post-truth are in battle with each other. The term post-truth was the 2016 word of the year by the Oxford dictionaries. They defined it as relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. And so we are all part of this global struggle between facts, evidence, truth, data, reality, and thinking versus post-truth, fake news, alternative facts, make-believe, groupthink, and distortions, and figuring out how to navigate in this difficult terrain where people are lined up to be told what they want to hear instead of being open to being told the truth, where we have this conflict between the political and the scientific. In the March for Science in the United States, one of the most common signs was Make America Think Again. In Nobel laureates, as they make their acceptance speeches, often emphasize the importance of thinking in science. Percy Bridgman, who won the 1946 Nobel Prize in Chemistry, asked about how he did, what his method was, and he said, quote, "There is no scientific method as such, but the vital feature of the scientist's procedures has been merely to do his utmost with his mind, no holds barred." The great Carl Sagan said science is a way of thinking much more than it is a body of knowledge, picked up by Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's taken the mantle as a cosmologist, and says, "You've never seen me debate anybody on anything, ever. My investment of time as an educator, in my judgment, is best served teaching people how to think about the world around them. Teach them how to pose a question, how to judge whether one thing is true versus another." And that's our challenge, getting people not to just believe that evidence is important, but that they know how to make sense of it. Michael Scriven, who we lost in August, our great thought pioneers, helped create the field of evaluation, wrote a book about reasoning. And he opens that book by saying, "Reasoning is the only ability that makes it possible for humans to rule the earth or to ruin it. All other alleged distinctions between us and other life forms on the planet turn out to be illusory." I did a book with Elizabeth Minnick on what we called thought work, subtitled Thinking, Action, and the Fate of the World, in which we looked at different kinds of thinking. and the importance of being prepared to think. Pasteur's famous comment that chance favors the prepared mind. Deep learning involves a mindfulness and intention to take in evidence and interpret thoughtfully. So rigorous evaluative thinking includes systems thinking, strategic thinking, design thinking, complexity thinking, scientific thinking, mixed methods thinking, principles-driven thinking, innovation-focused thinking, impact thinking, but thinking. Ernie House picked up on the Greek notions of truth, beauty, and justice and gave us a frame for thinking about these virtues in our current era. He described truth as the attainment of arguments soundly made, so that interpreting data to get at the truth means engaging with the data, warranting the arguments, making the story clear about what the data reveal. That's the pathway to truth. Beauty is the attainment of coherence well wrought, that the story is coherent and meaningful, and that justice is the attainment of politics fairly done around truth and beauty. But what we're up against is the dark side of all of this. And I suspect most of you have seen or heard the data, been widely reported, of the MIT study that studied how false data is spread, the science of fake news. They studied 126,000 Twitter cascades over 12 years and found that falsehoods were 70% more likely to be retweeted. The time it took for a false claim to reach 1,500 people was 6 times faster than true news. And so we are a part of this global battle, not just truth and post-truth, but bullshit, lying, deceit, and infodemia of misinformation. Part of understanding this, according to Daniel Kahneman's work, won the Nobel Prize as a psychologist in economics for his work on decision-making and thinking. And again, I suspect most of you are familiar with his work, that our system one, the quick fight or flight part of our brains, is fairly lazy. And we really don't want to move, he says, into system two, where you would do slow, deep system thinking. And so in his work at looking at how we actually operate, that we are resistant to deep thinking. We look for easy answers. We look for answers that tell us we don't have to go further at this, and that our rationality is bounded and distorted. All of us. A major barrier to appropriately interpreting evidence is our biased and illogical interpretation and decision-making processes. This includes selective perception, how we process information in ways that are distorting. Behavior finance has made the incredible discovery in economics that people's decision-making about money is, of all things, emotional. When I was in undergraduate school many, many years ago, the myth of economic man was this totally rational being with perfect information making completely informed decisions and rational decisions. What we now know is that that's mitigated by deep feelings, emotions, fears, greed, anxiety, and that there are heuristics that affect how we interpret data. The anchoring heuristic, where we interpret data in ways that we have in the past. The representative heuristic, where we interpret data in terms of the things that are most common in our experience. And so this builds on work from another Nobel Prize winner, social scientist Herbert Simon, for his pioneering research into the decision-making process around satisficing, that we can't know all the possibilities. We can't have perfect information. We don't even optimize, much less maximize. We make decisions on a good enough basis when we've arrived at a good enough place to say, all right, that satisfies what I need. And he writes, in an information-rich world, the wealth of information means a dearth of something else, a scarcity of attention. A wealth of information creates a poverty of attention. Kahneman writes, a reliable way to make people believe in falsehoods is frequent repetition, because familiarity is not easily distinguished from truth. Authoritarian institutions and marketers have always known this fact. And so let me take you through an example of the high stakes involved in weak, poor, shallow thinking. Take you back to 9/11, the World Trade Center, and the attack upon the World Trade Center, which led to the identification of Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan, but also the belief that Saddam Hussein was connected to 9/11 and had weapons of mass destruction. And so on March 20th, 2003, the United States invaded Iraq in the search for weapons of mass destruction. The justification of that from the intelligence community providing evidence to the United Nations and the world that there were definitely weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And General Colin Powell making that testimony and presenting that evidence. And of course, it turned out that there were no weapons of mass destruction. There was a major investigation of that intelligence failure. The Commission on the Intelligence Capabilities of the United States regarding weapons of mass destruction concluded that the intelligence community was dead wrong in almost all of its pre-war judgments about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. This was a major intelligence failure. Its principal causes were the intelligence community's inability to collect good information about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction programs, serious errors in analyzing what information it could gather, and a failure to make clear just how much of its analysis was based on assumptions rather than good evidence. On a matter of this importance, we simply cannot afford failures of this magnitude. They went on to say, after thorough review, the Commission found no indication that the intelligence community distorted the evidence regarding Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. What the intelligence professionals told you about Saddam Hussein's programs was what they believed. They were simply wrong. They talk about this as if the problem was inadequate evidence. But in fact, the intelligence community itself concluded that it was an inadequate interpretation. They assembled, deeply depressed from their failure and deeply embarrassed, senior intelligence analysts got together at Ohio State University and tried to figure out how they had gotten it so wrong. And they concluded that the making inferences from the available data and determining the best explanation for uncertainty, contradictory, or incomplete data required a more thorough and systematic analysis than they had done, that they had engaged in shallow, simple analysis, and instead they created what they called the rigor attribute model, where rigor is understood by assessing the contextual sufficiency of the analytic process, and a cognitive systems approach that focuses on the thinking process and making sense of the evidence. The rigor attribute model then identified the need for hypothesis exploration, the extent to which multiple hypotheses are considered in explaining data. In a low rigor process, there is minimal weighing of alternatives. Information validation that details the level at which information sources are corroborated and cross-validated. It turned out that all 12 intelligence agencies were using the same one key informant, a high-level former Iraqi official who subsequently was named Curveball, and they weren't sharing who their source was, so they thought they had triangulation, when in fact they all had the same information source. Stance analysis is the evaluation of data with the goal of identifying the stance or perspective of the source and placing it in the broader context of understanding. Sensitivity analysis, the extent to which the analyst considers and understands the assumptions and limitations of the analysis. Information synthesis refers to how far beyond simply collecting and listing data analysts went in their process. And explanation critique. a different form of collaboration that captures how many different perspectives were incorporated in examining the primary hypotheses. Rigor then, and this is the key point, rigor does not reside in methods. Randomized controlled trials are not inherently rigorous, more rigorous than case studies or anything else. Methods and measures are simply tools. Rigor resides in thinking. Methods do not ensure rigor. A research design does not ensure rigor. Analytical techniques and procedures do not ensure rigor. Rigor resides in, depends on, and is manifest in rigorous thinking about everything, including methods and analysis. The thread that runs through this rumination is the importance of intellectual rigor. There are no simple formulas or clear-cut rules about how to do a credible, high-quality analysis. The task is to do one's best to make sense of things. And so this carries through, catching up with what happened in Iraq after the invasion and the subsequent development. There was a 10-year review of Iraq's development aid, not the military aid, in which they captured lessons from that development and came up with seven major lessons. They identify all of the mistakes made culturally, politically. The American military and State Department didn't understand Iraq, that they didn't understand the cultural, religious, political, historical conditions. And they go through actually in the report showing that the understanding of what was going on, the deep assumptions that Iraqis were going to welcome the invasion with open arms, the general lack of understanding of context, and then their overall conclusion, the lesson they take, is that they needed better planning. Plan in advance, plan comprehensive and in an integrated fashion, and have backup plans ready to go. As Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta noted, in the Iraq program's early phases revealed a lack of thought with regard to planning. Now, from my point of view, that's a classic example of not thinking. What they've done is fall back on the default position of analysts to say, well, we need better planning. Better planning was not going to help them, given the deep assumptions that were wrong, the general unappreciation of what was going on. And so a default recommendation and lesson to plan better is an example of the banality of good, of doing something that people associate with good, but that in fact is not following the data. You can't look at that report, in my view, look at all the mistakes that were made, all the ignorance, the hubris, and say, well, we just need better planning. And so as Hegel famously said, we learn from history that we do not learn from history. So what Hannah Arendt suggested was that she proposed, the final writing she did, that people needed to learn to think by practicing thinking. She wrote a book on 8 exercises in political thought, in which she said experience in thinking can be won, like all experience, in doing something only through practice, through exercises. Arendt thought it important to help people learn to think conceptually, to discover the real origins of original concepts in order to distill from them anew their original spirit, which has so sadly evaporated from the very keywords of political language, such as freedom and justice, authority and reason, responsibility and virtue, power and glory, leaving behind empty shells. So let me close by suggesting the ways in which evaluation itself needs to engage in some thinking transformations. We need, in the face of the complexities of our global challenges that you've been discussing, move from project thinking. We say evaluation grew up in the projects. We have a project mentality. Our tools and logic models and SMART goals are all project-based. We need to move to be able to think in terms of complex dynamic systems thinking. We need to be able to think globally, to connect the local with the global, to understand the larger context within which interventions are taking place. We need to be able to think and track at different levels across time, the macro, micro, meso, and macro. We need to think systemically and holistically beyond the silos that we're in. And we need to understand evaluation as interdependent, not just independent, that it's a relationship and people business, and how we engage with people is an important part of that. And in all of this, we get more deeply engaged with systems thinking and systems learning to understand interrelationships, engage with perspectives, and reflect on boundaries. And so in the face of the global poly crisis, the challenges that we face in the world that you've been dealing with, and the climate emergency, the inequity emergencies, we are at a place with the poly crisis, the misinformation epidemic, growing injustices, the pandemic, economic turbulence, that evaluators need to be able to take this larger context into account and think systemically about this. I leave you then with a vision of evaluation for a sustainable and equitable future that involves deep thinking about our work, our contributions, helping the people we work with and support to be able to think, make sense of data, and to imagine that Aretha Franklin, who did a song about thinking, imagine Aretha Franklin as Mother Earth, the mother of soul, the goddess of soul, as Mother Earth, telling us to think. Here she says, "You gotta think about what it's trying to do to me. Oh, think, let your mind go, let yourself be free. People walk around everything, playing games, taking scores, trying to make other people lose their mind. Well, therefore you don't lose your mind. Oh, think about what it's trying to do to me. Woo-hoo. Think, let your mind go, let yourself be free. You need me, and I need you. Without each other, ain't nothing easy to do. Oh, think about it, baby. Think about it right now.
Michael, thank you. I think it was absolutely brilliant. And I think if we were in person, you'd have a room full of people standing and applauding. And I hope also many of us singing along together with Aretha Franklin. It was a brilliant presentation and you covered so much. And I would also say thank you because you spoke to what we need most within the evaluation field, within PVE and CVE, because as we have discussed in different ways today, so much of what is done in this field is the banality of evaluation and is doing evaluation as a pro forma exercise and something that's called for by donors and looking within fixed and rigid mindsets without necessarily thinking about and looking at that meta context and developing the capacity to interpret, the capacity to question, the capacity to reflect. I engaged deeply in Iraq over a number of years in one of the largest evaluations that was carried out about what happened in the country and how it went into war following the invasion and the occupation. And you're referencing that leads me to ask about what you've been writing and speaking a lot more to over the last years, and you did it today as well, polycrisis. And within our field, where we're working to try to address and to understand how to tackle violent extremism and radicalization, we often focus on the manifestations. We often focus on trying to identify the lone wolf person or the person who becomes radicalized, while in the broader context, in the time since the Iraq invasion, or if we look at just the last 10 years, we've actually more than doubled the number of wars in the world. The number of wars has more than doubled. The number of people displaced from violent conflict and from environmental destruction has gone from 36 million just over 10 years ago to 111 million people last year. And in this context, where many of the crises and the underlying challenges that we're facing are growing, and they're systemic, they're multi-causal, they're interconnected, one question is our capacity to address them. Are we rising to that? So that's one question, your reflections on our capacity to address it. The other is, you spoke about the banality in evaluation, but I've also been inspired in your writing and the work of others as well, when you speak about needing to develop the way we interpret our environment, our capacity to interpret, to make sense of what can be, and what do you want to see as the role of evaluation in this context. In a world in which we have polycrisis, in a world in which we are confronted not only with the challenges of our individual decision-making processes and mental capacities and how we think, but also in our systems and how they engage and address these crises. What would you see as the role of evaluators and the role of evaluation as you would like to see it?
It's a wonderful question. And let me try to give a focused answer. I see us, because we are not the decision makers, we are the facilitators of decision making. And so the skills that I think we especially need, and the way to commission studies in terms of reference, it has implications all throughout, is that so much of evaluation is focused on report writing and producing deliverables. But in fact, use is not a report. And so in logic modeling terms, a report is simply an output that we build into our work with decision makers, with organizations, the expectation that we're involved at the beginning in helping to frame questions and help them think about what they would actually do with information, where the gaps are, what don't you know that if you did know would make a difference to what you do, rather than a pro forma approach, and that we are viewed as facilitating the engagement with the data all the way through, and that getting people to deal with the polycrisis as a part of interpreting means it's not our interpretation, it's facilitating their interpretation, the decision making, the policy makers, the people in communities. I'll give you an example that that around the several major international organizations I've worked with, most evaluations require or produce recommendations. Michael Scriven long argued that we shouldn't be in the recommendations business. And it's the one thing Scriven and I agreed on for different reasons. He thought evaluators weren't competent to write recommendations. All we could do is decide whether or not something had worked or not. But I think we don't do recommendations because we're not the actors. That what we need to do is facilitate recommendations. But when you put recommendations in a report, and I was just consulting with a major organization last week, when you put recommendations in a report, the first thing management looks at is the recommendations, whether they like them or not. Then all the focus is on recommendations. That's the lightning rod, and they never engage with the data because it's all about the recommendations. And instead, I suggested, don't put in recommendations. If you do a good job of extracting lessons and that you're facilitating engaging with the data, and you become a skilled facilitator in context of the polycrisis, help people make decisions, help them deal with the data, what's known and not known, that's our role, not to tell people what to do in a recommendation. That gets out of date very quickly, and as I said, becomes a lightning rod. We should be facilitators of thinking, of evaluative thinking, and that's the key skill and the contribution I think we can make.
Thank you so much. Michael, Josephine Mwenda is with us. She plays a key role in the evaluation field and the work with the United Nations, and also working to support member states in building their capacity and their approaches to doing evaluation. And she raises a reflection in the chat here, and I'd like to build from that and get your thoughts on it. The deep thinking required in evaluating counterterrorism and preventing violent extremism requires investment in time, which is usually a constraint given factors already discussed. Need for timely accountability reporting. Be interesting to see how a balance can be struck. Now, in our current operating model in space and how we address it. We're often looking at short-term projects, need to produce results, and really looking at outputs, not looking at is it actually achieving any significant contribution or impact on the underlying issues or the context that we're addressing. And you'll often hear from evaluators and practitioners in this field of being under the pressure of time, while at the same time in our evaluations, we have identified that this constant focus on short-term measures, short-term interventions, project-based approaches are insufficient and often not only don't necessarily help, but sometimes are even counterproductive. Some of the things we're doing are actually making the situation worse. Do we need to shift how we're approaching it, how we're thinking about it? Instead of looking at how to find solutions within a system that doesn't work, do we need to try to think through and innovate models and approaches that might respond better to the nature and the scale of the challenges we face?
I think that given the theme of evidence here for your conference, is that one of the things that's worth pulling together, and I shared a little bit of it, a wine tasting of it, is the evidence about how good decisions actually get made. And that if we have an evidence-based decision-making approach, one of the things that will highlight is that good decision-making compared to bad decision-making engages time. To treat time as this luxury, to treat time as the ultimate add-on. I skipped some slides I had about leadership training to think evaluatively, but in fact, evaluative thinking for leaders, and I've done that kind of training, includes they're developing a commitment to think deeply about what's going on, to gather data, to understand, to get multiple perspectives, to understand context. And when I work with leaders and talk about, let's put together a frame of reference for your job as a leader, they virtually always exclude from that initial list thinking deeply. After we've spent an hour talking, they end up putting at the top of their list to be a thought leader in their organization, to demonstrate thinking, to lead by thinking. In fact, one of the manias that gets in the way of this is the whole huge technical assistance structure around meetings, how to do good meetings. Mm-hmm. It's all about taking action. Get an agenda, get through those items quickly, check them off, take action, make decisions. Nowhere in that entire infrastructure of running meetings is deep thinking, is spending time to get multiple perspectives, getting deeply into issues. It's just the opposite. And so I think we need to pull together the evidence that now there's a great deal of. What constitutes thoughtful work? The rigor attribute model is a part of that. And to begin building into our scopes of work and job descriptions for leaders at all levels, that thinking is a big part of your job, and spending time on thinking is a part of your job, and you get rewarded and incentivized for thinking, not just acting, but for thinking. And that improves decision making, and including in that thinking about evidence.
Michael, could I ask you, one of your many major contributions in the field has been your work on use and utilization and utilization-focused evaluation. And you were saying there's no best practices, but good practices we can learn from, bad practice, bad. And I think when it comes to the PVE, CVE field, with all respect to many and colleagues in the field, we are very much at the end of the bad practice in how we do evaluation, where the vast and overwhelming majority of what we think an evaluation should come to is the production of a report. Right. And they're often incredibly convoluted in how they're written. They're often designed to not be read, or to be read by a very limited handful of people. They are brought out either as a published report or in academic and scientific journals, and they don't reach practitioners. They don't reach the communities and the people who are affected by it. They're not done in ways that can be digested by policymakers and leaders within the field. You spoke about asking the question of what constitutes thoughtful work. and the need for deep thinking. In how we practice evaluation now, it is almost the absence of thinking. So we produce a report, but there's nothing then after that for how do we engage with it. And one thing we've commented on for years in our own organization is that very many people who come up in the evaluation field, at least those we've met with amongst thousands, have never even heard of, for many of them, the change management field. So in business, evaluation and change management are often built in together. But for evaluators, they often think that you do the study, you do the evaluation, you produce the report, and that's the end. And there is no one who takes up the role of looking at how do we engage with the learning? How do we bring that forward? And I wonder if you might have reflections or could share with us beyond the productions of reports. What are some of the processes, the instruments, the tools, the spaces that can be created to facilitate that deep thinking and that interpretive thinking to make sense of and to see then what changes are necessary in what we're doing and how we're improving and how we scale or change what we do?
It's a really important question. And in addition to all the other problems with reports that you mentioned, is that by the time they're written, they're out of date. So that it's old news by the time you get a polished report. And it takes huge amount of resources to write a report. So it's extremely costly to do these reports. They're out of date by the time they come out. So the contrary piece that you kindly mentioned before is developmental evaluation, which is understanding that the whole framing of evaluation for 50 years, and Scriven unfortunately gave us this because it seemed to make sense at the time, of summative evaluation, that you make a one-time big decision about whether something's go or no go, and that all the focus in evaluation is on that decision. Did the intervention work or not work, and therefore should it be taken to scale? And that's not how the world works. Decisions don't get made that way, and they're not one-off decisions forever. That in fact, there's ongoing decision making. There's constant adaptation, more than ever. The pandemic certainly illustrated that, but all these new wars that you talked about, the new conflicts that are going on, the increased refugees, the severity of climate, the Iraq report I referred to actually says that in retrospect, they should have had a 5-year plan at the beginning for Iraq. Imagine, who does 5-year plans anymore? That's absurd. So the ongoing incremental adaptive decision making and change management, real-time work, what are people facing, and how to track those decisions in real time, figure out where they're going, what else is going on. That's a developmental evaluation piece. And it doesn't involve in writing big reports. It involves a series of ongoing mini just adjustments. Every fork in the road becomes a place where you're helping them think about which ways to go, what to compare. And it builds evaluation thinking into a way of doing business, instead of saying, well, at the end of 3 years, we'll think evaluatively about a report. No, evaluative thinking becomes part of the culture, part of the way of leading, and it's ongoing, embedded in the culture of effective organizations.
Helping people think about building evaluative thinking into the process and embedding it in organizations, not only in external consultants or end of project evaluations that come in. The field is so rich. We are constantly innovating ways of doing learning and knowledge and engaging, but also so much stuck in approaches and models that we know don't work. I would love to continue discussing with you for hours, but I want to say thank you for your presentation, for your speech, for what you have shared with us for the Indeed Forum today. And just as much or even more to say thank you for your work of a lifetime and what you have done over decades. You are an inspiration to many of us, and you are helping us to work towards that role that evaluation can play in helping us to look at how to approach thinking and the thinking we need to truly be a meaningful part of addressing the polycrisis that we are in our world today. Thank you very much for what you've shared with us, and thank you for all you do.
Thank you for having me.